Seeking a renewed focus, NATO leaders meet for a summit viewed as the most crucial since the end of the Cold War. Will it mark a defining moment for the military alliance or a historic failure? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. It was hailed as a treaty for our age, a military alliance signed in the aftermath of the Second World War. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was founded in 1949, in part as a response to the threat posed by the Soviet Union and its allies during the Cold War. In the treaty's renowned Article 5, NATO members agreed that an armed attack against one or more of them shall be considered an attack against them all. 65 years on, and the 28-member alliance is confronting a pivotal moment of truth in the face of an alarming array of new challenges: Russian aggression in Ukraine, the growing menace of the Islamic State group in Syria and Iraq, declining defense budgets, and a fragmented political will. Jonah Hull helps set up our discussion from Newport in Wales, where NATO leaders have been holding a two-day summit.
In the South Wales countryside, NATO leaders and partners gathered in the face of world disorder and multiple threats, from Russia to Libya and the rise of the group called the Islamic State. 2 years ago, at the last NATO summit in Chicago, Russia's Prime Minister Medvedev was a special guest. This year, Vladimir Putin is the alliance's greatest challenge.
Russia is now fighting against Ukraine, in Ukraine. Russian troops and Russian tanks are attacking the Ukrainian forces. And while talking about peace, Russia has not made one single step to make peace possible.
This time, Ukraine's president is a special guest.
Ukraine is fighting for peace. Ukraine was not an initiator of war. Ukraine are object of the aggression. And we try to do our best for immediate stop the aggression and to immediate stop the fire.
As a non-member, Ukraine won't benefit from NATO military plans being discussed to deter further Russian aggression in Eastern Europe. On the sidelines of the summit, meanwhile, US President Barack Obama and British Prime Minister David Cameron are working with regional allies to form a coalition in the fight against IS in Iraq and Syria. And at the summit gates, anti-war protesters gathered. The message here that the only way out of conflict is dialogue.
I think most of the people here believe that NATO is an anachronistic organisation that should have folded after the end of the Cold War. And a lot of the people in NATO now seem to be delighted about what's happening between Russia and Ukraine and the chance to build up the Cold War again.
The NATO summit was originally supposed to be about the end of one war in Afghanistan, where NATO will bring combat operations to a close later this year. Instead, it's about dire threats to members and partners of the alliance on multiple fronts. There could be a lot more for anti-war protesters like these to shout about in future.
The summit is also about NATO itself, thrust back into the limelight, a Cold War alliance that had seemed to be losing its relevance. It must now prove its worth. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Newport, Wales.
So lots to talk about there. Let's get straight into it with our guests in Washington, D.C. Joining us from there, Kurt Volker, Executive Director of the McCain Institute for International Leadership and a former U.S. Ambassador to NATO. Joining us from Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, Defense and Foreign Policy Analyst. And also in Washington, we have Ivan Eland, the Defense Analyst at the Independent Institute. Good to have you all with us. Now, Kurt Volker, a treaty for our age is what they called it back in 1949. But as we know, the world is a very different place in 2014. Is NATO still relevant?
Absolutely relevant, because it is the only organization that brings the United States and Europe and Canada together in order to promote their common security. There isn't anything else that does that. So it is essentially very relevant, especially in a world where we've seen a multiplicity of security threats. The challenge, however, is that NATO is not necessarily living up to all of its potential in dealing with these threats. NATO has slashed its defense capabilities. It has withdrawn from Afghanistan, I would argue, more towards a timetable than based on accomplishment. And now in dealing with some of the new challenges that we see, whether it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine or whether it is some of the challenges in the Middle East, NATO seems very reluctant to take them on. Just look at Libya, for example. While I think NATO played an essential role in helping the Libyan people remove themselves of Muammar Gaddafi, it played no role in creating a stability operation and security as a follow-on. And as a result, I think we see a great deal of chaos in Libya right now.
Ivan Eland, fair to say this is a pivotal moment in NATO's history. Is this, I mean, how are they handling it? Are they living up to it?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, you see that there's a reluctance to call it a Russian invasion. You see a reluctance to provide military equipment to the Ukraine. Now, I'm not suggesting that those are good things, because I think NATO is way overextended. They kept expanding, and there's no way that you can defend the Baltics, even though Obama is trying to tell us that he can, without using nuclear weapons. I mean, it's so far forward. The Russians have local superiority, and the Russians would have a local superiority in many of those Eastern European countries. And so I think the NATO alliance is overextended. It's a fantasy that it's a mutual defense organization. It's an organization by which the United States provides defense for wealthy countries who can now afford to pay their own bill and should be doing more. And they're never going to do more because the U.S. foots the bill. So that's why you see declining. We can gripe about other countries' declining defense budgets, but the reason is because of the free rider problem that NATO has always had, and it increased after the Cold War, and it's still present. So I think that, and the other thing is that NATO expansion has caused the rise of a nationalist leader in Russia, and so we're experiencing the downside of that now.
Yeah, I want to bring up the issue of who's financing all of this and where the money should be coming from in a moment. But I want to get the view from Moscow. Pavel Felgenhauer, how is Russia going to be looking at all of this?
Well, for Russia, NATO is a very serious security problem, always has been. It has always been at the center of Russian military planning. Even before the Ukrainian crisis right now has began to kind of restore a Cold War atmosphere. The Russian military were preparing to defend the Kaliningrad enclave, thinking about possible air attacks sort of on the Yugoslav or Iraq or Libya style against Russia. NATO, I mean, the West was not actually investing much into immediate infrastructure close to Russian borders. Russia was investing. And so now when NATO seems to be somehow revived in its core mission, that will be welcomed to some extent, kind of cynically by the Russian military foreign policy establishment. An enemy is back. It's always good to have an enemy that most likely won't attack but can promote more defense spending. And this is an enemy we had for many, many years, since '49. People there in command of the Russian military and foreign policy, they know that. They were there during the Cold War. So it's, and most likely there's the same attitude from the other side. Cold warriors are right now back in the same trenches, and most likely many like it.
Well, let's expand on some of these points now and remind ourselves as well that NATO has played an active role in a broad range of operations and missions. Afghanistan, of course, remains NATO's biggest military operation. The mission began there in 2003 and is due to end this year. But questions remain over Afghanistan's security and political stability. NATO has had a force in Kosovo since 1999, when the country was facing a grave humanitarian crisis. The mission there is seen as a success. NATO's 2011 intervention in Libya was initially acknowledged as a humanitarian success, but critics argue NATO's involvement actually prolonged the conflict, with the country still in crisis. And then there's Iraq. NATO trained Iraqi forces from 2004 to 2011, but the rise of the Islamic State group is evidence that there were no lasting results. The British Prime Minister David Cameron says NATO now needs to refocus. Here's what he had to say at the summit in Wales.
We face new and evolving dangers. To the east, Russia is ripping up the rulebook with its annexation of Crimea and its troops on sovereign soil in Ukraine. To the south, an arc of instability bends from North Africa to the Middle East. Last night, we discussed the threat posed by ISIL in Iraq and Syria. So our message is clear. We are united in condemnation of these barbaric and despicable acts.
Now, David Cameron outlined a three-point plan as well to take NATO forward. He called for a multinational rapid response force to be restored, a commitment by NATO members to spend 2% of GDP on defence, and he wants a more effective security network that fosters stability around the world. So let's talk about those 3 points then. Kurt Volker, is this, in your view, the right way forward? Are these measures realistic?
It is the right way forward, and it is realistic. It is something that NATO has had on the books for a long time, all of these elements. The response force, during the Cold War, there was something called the Ace Mobile Force. It was disbanded. In 2002, NATO proposed creation of a NATO response force. It was never fully fleshed out, never fully resourced. 2% of GDP as a target for defense spending has been around for a long time as well. Again, most NATO countries do not live up to that. And probably where NATO has done the best is building partnerships. And there are now very vibrant partnerships with countries around the world, whether it's in Eastern Europe or the African Union or the Gulf states with the Istanbul Partnership Initiative, even some in East Asia. So partnership has gone well. But these are all areas that need to be reinforced. As Ivan said earlier, NATO has really hollowed itself out a lot after the end of the Cold War. There has been a bit of a free rider problem, and what David Cameron is saying is it is time for Europe to reverse that. Yeah,
I want to pick up on the point that you mentioned just a little bit earlier about the global partnerships, and you talked about partnering up with the Gulf states, for example, and Africa. Is that really the way forward for NATO? Because, of course, I mean, NATO has always been an organization that's concentrated in Western Europe and North America, but there are, of course, regional alliances elsewhere in the world. Does NATO need to recognize that now?
Well, it does, and I think it has for some time. So go back to the 90s. NATO had really only conceived of defending itself or operating in a NATO versus Warsaw Pact environment. And then we had the war in Kosovo. The war in Bosnia. And in Bosnia, NATO decided for the first time to act in what it called out of area, that it wasn't NATO territory, and yet, because of its capabilities, it could engage in crisis management, project security, take on a peacekeeping role under a UN mandate. It did the same thing in Kosovo. It is doing that now in Afghanistan. And I think that trend, that the security challenges are going to be outside of NATO territory, where NATO can contribute but shouldn't be the only actor or the lead actor. It needs to work in partnership with local actors. And so working with the African Union, working with the Gulf states, even in Afghanistan, while there are 28 NATO countries, the coalition of ISAF in Afghanistan has included over 40 countries. And so I think this partnership with others is definitely one of the ways of the future.
Pavel Falkenhauer, how's Russia going to react to all of this? I mean, when you look at things like this rapid response force to be beefed up and commitments to spend more money on defense, I mean, the Kremlin's likely to take a dim view of all this, isn't it?
Well, officially, yes, of course, most likely it will be condemned. Though, again, there's a silver lining, because increased threat, more viable threat, is something that the Russian defense establishment can better sell to its own people and the political leadership, that there is a perceived serious threat, and that means more should be spent on defense to defend against that threat. This is the game that was played during the Cold War very successfully by defense establishments east and west, and I believe it can come back again. There's, of course, been some partnership between Russia and NATO, specifically in Afghanistan. Apparently now that's a thing of the past. NATO is going out of Afghanistan, and Russia and NATO are hardly right now in an atmosphere to cooperate. But there is other kind of cooperation. It's a kind of cooperation between opponents. When two opponents stand against each other and each points at the other saying he's a threat, and we can get more money for our own programs because we have that threat facing us.
Ivan Eland, you talked earlier about the declining defense budgets, and there's plenty of evidence for that. But what about the public's appetite for all of this, particularly in Western Europe and the United States right now? We've had 10 years of NATO, more than 10 years of NATO in Afghanistan. We had the campaign in Libya, which initially was looked at as a success, but now we're seeing a lot of internal conflict or militias fighting against each other. I mean, there is this kind of war weariness among the public right now. So does it justify increasing the budgets? How do you sell that to the public?
Well, I think it's easier done in the U.S. We never seem to get that defense, holiday. After the Cold War, we didn't get it, and of course, after the Afghan and Iraq War, we didn't get it here in the U.S. And we have quite a military-industrial complex which finds threats everywhere. So it's hard. It's easier to get the U.S. to spend money, but the Europeans, they're tired of being in Afghanistan, and they're tired of the results that they got in Libya. And I think they've never been very enthusiastic about spending money on defense. They would rather let the U.S. Spend the money so that they can put those resources into other things, including competing with the U.S. economically. So I think we really need to we needed to address the NATO after the Cold War. I'm very suspicious of organizations that hang around and change their mission. NATO was supposed to defend Western Europe, and now it's a power projection force to go into Libya, Kosovo, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and sometimes they have success, sometimes they don't, but they're not going to their original purpose. And of course, the Europeans, lose interest when they go out of area, because the Europeans want their own defense, U.S. to pay for their own defense, but not necessarily, they're not enthusiastic. And all this out of area stuff, a lot of times it's the U.S. Doing the job and the hard work, and the other people acting as a fig leaf, a multilateral fig leaf. And that's, there's a three-tier alliance. There's the U.S., there's Britain and France, and then there's the rest of the countries who don't do much at all. And so, but even in the case of Britain and France, the U.S. usually does the heavy lifting for the alliance in these power projection missions.
I want to put this to Kurt Volker then. There is a school of thought that says that NATO enlargement isn't really the best way forward, and talk of Ukraine, for example, joining NATO just adds more fuel to the fire to further provoke Russian President Putin, and it ignores the dynamic in the region. As a former ambassador to NATO, what would you say to that?
Let's remember where all this comes from. You had the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact imposing communist governments in Eastern Europe for 40 years. When those countries finally threw that off and became truly independent, they wanted to be democracies, they wanted to be market economies, and they wanted to be secure so that they wouldn't have to go through anything like that ever again. So they wanted to join NATO. NATO said, not so fast. In order to join this alliance, you have to be able to prove that you are a democracy, market economy, have the rule of law, contribute to common security. And it took several years. It took from 1989, when the wall came down, until 1997 before any country was invited to join NATO. It took another few years after that, to 2002, for others to be invited. So NATO is cautious on this. But the bottom line is that now there are 100 million people, more than 100 million, in Central and Eastern Europe who live in free societies, democracies, and who are safe and secure, so they don't have to worry about the security of their countries and future generations. There's no reason why other countries in Europe who aspire to those same things should not be able to achieve them. And if Ukraine aspires to that, it has every right to do so. The history with Ukraine, however, is that NATO did not invite Ukraine to join NATO. In 2008, after Ukraine had requested consideration for the Membership Action Plan, NATO said, in a long-term perspective, sure, you can be a member, but we're not offering the Membership Action Plan and we're not extending an invitation now. Then that Ukrainian government was voted out. Yanukovych came in, and he did not want to pursue it any further. And frankly, that has been the last movement on anything concerning NATO and Ukraine until after Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea, where now this is back in the public discussion again. But no one is seriously talking about admitting Ukraine in the near term. They're still not ready. That being said, the Ukrainians do have a right to determine their own future.
Yeah, I want to put some of that to Pavel Felgenhauer and this perception that Russia has, Russia's entitled to feel threatened by this NATO expansion because it's grown closer to their borders and what it calls its near abroad, if you like. But the point was made there by Kurt Volker that these countries made a conscious choice to join NATO. They weren't forced into it. This is something that they wanted to do.
Well, that's not the entire story, actually. I was present there at a seminar in Budapest of PR workers who were talking about how they worked the referendum in Hungary and the Czech Republic and in Slovakia, where actually the population was not very enthusiastic about joining. In the Baltics and in Poland, a different story. But there a lot of money was put into propaganda actually to get a yes vote on the referendum. And right now, these are not very enthusiastic NATO members. I mean, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, they don't see right now any threat coming from Russia, and they were to some extent pulled in. So, of course, by their own political establishments too, not just some kind of Western bad entity. But so there was a kind of element of pulling in reluctant populations, and now these reluctant countries are not making very good allies inside NATO. While Russia, beginning from the 90s, felt itself increasingly isolated, and anti-Western feelings began to grow here in Russia and are now actually overwhelming.
Well,
so that was not a very good end result.
Sorry to interrupt, Pavel. I just want to ask you about the point about many of these countries don't feel threatened by Russia. If you look at the Baltic states, that's not the case, is it? I mean, these countries have large Russian populations, and when President Putin talks about going into Ukraine to protect what he says is the Russian-speaking populations, these countries are in the same boat, and that's why they fear Russia's moves. They're entitled to fear that, aren't they?
Oh, yes. I mean, I said that the Baltics and Poland are a totally different story. But I was talking about Hungary, Romania, not even Romania, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, which were rather reluctant, at least a large part of their populations. Yes, the Baltics are, but they cannot defend themselves. They are not very much an asset. And actually, the West was not prepared to really do much there. Now the thing is changing, and maybe actually the Scandinavian countries right now feel a lot of solidarity with the Baltic people, and most likely even neutral Scandinavian countries are moving closer to NATO. While some NATO members like the Czech Republic and Hungary Hungary are moving in the other direction. NATO has become too big and too diverse to be an effective military alliance, but of course it provides the groundwork for alliances of the willing, which makes it maybe worthwhile to some extent. And of course, in Russia, in Moscow, many people would see it as a total catastrophe if NATO just disappeared, because we would have lost an enemy.
All right, and on that note, we are going to have to leave it. Thank you to all three of our guests, Kurt Volker, Pavel Felgenhauer, and Ivan Eland. Thanks very much for your time. And please let us know your thoughts. You can always leave your comments to us on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter @AJ Inside Story is where to find us. I'm Hazem Seeker. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.